The first gunshot echoed through Lincoln High School at 10:23 a.m., sending 847 students and faculty into panic. Within seconds, the school's emergency alert system was blaring. Classroom doors were slamming shut, and teachers were frantically calling 911. But in room 237, something different was happening. James Mitchell, the quiet substitute teacher that students have been mocking all morning, calmly moved to the door, assessed the tactical situation, and began implementing security protocols that no civilian should have known existed. The paper airplane that had hit Jim in the face just 20 minutes earlier was still crumpled on the floor near his desk, a reminder of how little respect his advanced math class had shown him since he'd started substitute teaching 3 weeks ago. Tyler Harrison, the class clown who sat in the back row, had been the ringleader of the constant disruption, making jokes about the pathetic sub who couldn't even maintain basic classroom discipline. Mr. Mitchell can't even handle a bunch of teenagers. Tyler had whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. What kind of loser becomes a permanent substitute teacher anyway? The other students had laughed, continuing their conversations and ignoring Jim's attempts to teach polynomial equations. Sarah Chun had been openly doing homework for another class. Marcus Williams was playing games on his phone. Jessica Rodriguez had been texting her boyfriend, occasionally looking up to roll her eyes at Jim's ineffective attempts to gain their attention. Welcome to those who left a trace, where ordinary people carry the most extraordinary secrets. Before we dive into this incredible story of a substitute teacher whose hidden past would save an entire school from tragedy, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that respect should never be based on appearances alone, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community of over 650,000 subscribers who love these powerful stories that prove heroes come in the most unexpected forms. What none of these students knew was that James Mitchell had spent the previous 8 years as a member of Navy SEAL Team 6, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. The man they saw as an ineffective substitute teacher had conducted 47 combat missions across Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, eliminating high-value targets and executing complex operations that required split-second decision-making under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Jim's transition from elite special operator to substitute teacher hadn't been voluntary. 18 months earlier, during a classified mission in eastern Afghanistan, an improvised explosive device had detonated near his position, sending shrapnel into his left leg and causing traumatic brain injury that ended his military career. The physical wounds had healed, but the invisible injuries, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life, had proven more challenging to overcome. The Navy had offered him various positions within the special operations community, but Jim had declined them all. He needed distance from the world of violence and constant readiness that had defined his adult life. Teaching had seemed like the perfect antidote to his military experience, a peaceful profession focused on building rather than destroying, nurturing rather than eliminating, protecting through education rather than through force of arms. But the transition had been far more difficult than Jim had anticipated. At 34 years old, he had no formal teaching credentials and limited experience working with civilians, especially teenagers who had no understanding of discipline, respect, or the kind of focused attention that can mean the difference between life and death in operational environments. The substitute teaching position at Lincoln High had been his entry point into the education system while he completed his teaching certification through an accelerated program designed for military veterans. The pay was minimal, the respect was non-existent, and the daily challenges of managing undisciplined teenagers often left him questioning whether he had made the right career choice. Jim's military training had taught him to maintain operational security about his background, so none of his colleagues or students knew about his previous career. To them, he was simply James Mitchell, a somewhat awkward substitute teacher who seemed uncomfortable in classroom environments and struggled to maintain authority over teenage students who sensed uncertainty in his new role. The morning of October 15th had started like every other day of Jim's brief teaching career. He had arrived at Lincoln High at 7:15 a.m., reviewed lesson plans for classes he would be covering, and prepared himself for another day of dealing with disrespectful students who viewed substitute teachers as glorified babysitters rather than educational professionals. His first period advanced math class had been particularly challenging. The regular teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was recovering from surgery and would be out for at least 6 weeks, meaning Jim would be working with these students long enough for them to really test his authority and classroom management skills. Tyler Harrison had established himself as a primary disruptor, constantly talking, making jokes, and encouraging other students to ignore Jim's instructions. The paper airplane incident had been the culmination of 3 weeks of escalating disrespect, thrown while Jim was writing equations on the whiteboard with his back to the class. "Nice shot, Tyler," Marcus had said, loud enough for Jim to hear. "Maybe you should try out for the baseball team." The comment had generated more laughter, and Jim had felt a familiar surge of frustration that had become his constant companion since starting this job. In his military career, disrespect had never been an option. Orders were followed immediately and without question, because lives depended on instant compliance and absolute trust in leadership. But teenage students weren't Navy SEALs, and classroom management required entirely different skills than leading special operations teams. Jim had been struggling to adapt his leadership style to civilian education, often feeling completely out of his depth when dealing with students who had no concept of the discipline and focus that had been second nature to him for nearly a decade. The first gunshot had come from the main hallway, approximately 150 feet from room 237 based on the acoustic signature, and the slight delay before the school's emergency alert system activated. Jim's military training immediately kicked in, overriding his civilian persona as his mind shifted into the tactical assessment mode that had kept him alive through dozens of combat missions. Within 3 seconds of hearing the gunshot, Jim had processed multiple pieces of critical information. The weapon was a high-caliber rifle, probably a semi-automatic, fired from inside the building. The shooter was moving through the main corridor, based on the echo patterns in the direction of panicked screaming. The school's lockdown procedures were being activated, but they were designed for passive defense rather than active threat neutralization. "Everyone on the floor now," Jim commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. The casual, uncertain tone he had used for 3 weeks as a substitute teacher had vanished, replaced by the crisp, commanding presence of a combat veteran who understood exactly what was happening and what needed to be done. The students, who had been laughing and joking just moments before, immediately recognized a dramatic change in their substitute teacher's demeanor. Tyler Harrison, who had been preparing another paper airplane, froze with the paper half folded in his hands. Sarah Chin looked up from her homework with wide eyes. Marcus Williams dropped his phone, finally giving Jim his complete attention. "I said on the floor," Jim repeated, his voice cutting through the chaos of the emergency alert system. "Move away from the windows and the door. Get behind the desks in the back corner of the room." This time, every student complied immediately. Whatever they had thought about their substitute teacher, the man giving orders now was clearly someone who knew how to handle dangerous situations. His confidence was absolute, his instructions were precise, and his presence radiated the kind of calm competence that made people want to follow his lead even in the midst of crisis. Jim moved the classroom door with fluid, purposeful steps that revealed years of tactical training. He turned the lock and then did something that surprised the students. Instead of simply securing the door according to standard lockdown procedures, he began repositioning desks and chairs to create a defensive barricade that would prevent the door from being forced open even if the lock failed. "Tyler, Marcus, help me move these desks," Jim ordered. "Sarah, Jessica, I need you to check that supply closet and tell me what's in there that we can use. Everyone else, stay low and stay quiet." The students, who had never seen their substitute teacher display any kind of authority or leadership, found themselves following his instructions without question. Tyler and Marcus immediately began helping to move furniture, working with focused intensity that was completely different from their usual classroom behavior. As they worked, Jim was conducting a detailed tactical assessment of their situation. Room 237 was on the second floor of the school's main building, with windows facing the parking lot and a single door leading to the main hallway. The room's position provided some advantages. It was far enough from the main entrance to give them time to prepare, and the second floor location made it difficult for Shooter to approach from multiple directions. But the standard school lockdown procedures were woefully inadequate for the kind of active shooter situation they were facing. Simply locking the door and hiding in a corner was a passive defense strategy that left them completely vulnerable if the shooter decided to target their specific classroom. Jim's military experience had taught him that survival in hostile environments required active defensive measures, strategic positioning, and contingency planning for multiple scenarios. He began implementing tactical procedures that he had learned during close-quarters combat training, adapting them for a civilian environment and teenage students who had no military training. "Listen carefully," Jim said, keeping his voice calm but urgent. "We're going to set up defensive positions that will keep everyone safe until help arrives. Sarah, what did you find in that closet?" "Cleaning supplies, paper, some tools," Sarah reported, her voice shaky but focused. "Bring me anything that could be used as a weapon or distraction device," Jim instructed. "Spray bottles, scissors, anything with a sharp edge or that could temporarily blind someone." Jessica raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Mitchell, how do you know how to do all this?" Jim paused for a moment, realizing that his carefully maintained cover as an ordinary substitute teacher was being stripped away by necessity. "I used to have a different job," he said simply. "Right now, that experience is going to help keep all of you alive." The students exchanged glances, beginning to understand that their substitute teacher was far more than he had appeared to be. Tyler Harrison, who had been making jokes about Jim's incompetence just an hour earlier, was now watching him with something approaching awe as he transformed their classroom into a defensive position with professional efficiency. Jim positioned the heaviest desks to create a barrier that would force anyone entering the room to move through a narrow choke point where they could be more easily confronted. He arranged the remaining furniture to create concealed positions where students could take cover while maintaining sight lines to the door and windows. Most importantly, he began teaching his students basic tactical principles that could help them survive if the situation deteriorated further. He showed them how to move quietly, how to position themselves to avoid being silhouetted against windows, and how to create improvised weapons from classroom materials. "If someone comes through that door who isn't a police officer or school security, we're going to respond as a team," Jim explained. "Your job is to follow my instructions exactly, without hesitation, and trust that I know how to handle this situation." Outside room 237, the sounds of chaos were intensifying. More gunshots echoed through the building, accompanied by screaming, running footsteps, and the wailing of emergency sirens as first responders arrived at the school. Jim could hear commands being shouted in the hallway, but he couldn't determine whether they were coming from law enforcement or from Shooter. Using his military communication training, Jim began monitoring radio chatter from emergency responders using a scanner app on his phone. The information he gathered was troubling. There were at least 2 shooters moving through the building. They were heavily armed with military-style weapons, and they appeared to be targeting specific areas of the school rather than moving randomly. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Jim looked at his students, the same teenagers who had been mocking him and refusing to pay attention to his math lessons just minutes earlier. Now they were looking to him for protection and guidance, trusting him with their lives, a way that reminded him of the young soldiers he had led in combat operations overseas. "Yes," Jim said with absolute conviction, "we're going to be okay. But I need everyone to stay focused and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that?" Every student nodded, their earlier disrespect replaced by complete trust in the man who had revealed himself to be far more capable than any of them had imagined. Jim spent the next 20 minutes implementing increasingly sophisticated defensive measures. He created multiple fallback positions within the classroom, established communication protocols with emergency responders, and prepared his students for various scenarios depending on how the situation developed. Using skills learned during urban combat training, Jim turned everyday classroom materials into effective defensive tools. Textbooks became improvised shields. Scissors and box cutters became close-quarters weapons. Spray bottles filled with cleaning chemicals became temporary blinding agents. More importantly, he began teaching his students the mental skills needed to survive a life-threatening situation. He showed them how to control their breathing to manage fear, how to maintain situational awareness under stress, and how to make split-second decisions when every choice could mean the difference between life and death. In situations like this, your mind is your most important weapon, Jim explained, drawing on lessons learned during SEAL training. Fear will make you freeze, but if you stay focused on what you need to do next, you can get through anything. The classroom door suddenly rattled as someone tried to open it from the hallway. Jim immediately signaled for complete silence, moving into position behind the barricade with improvised weapons ready. The students flattened themselves against the floor, following the positioning he had taught them. "Police, open the door!" a voice shouted from the hallway. Jim hesitated, using his tactical training to assess whether the voice was legitimate or potentially a deception by the shooter. The tone and cadence sounded authentic, but he had learned during military operations that tactical deception was a common strategy used by hostile forces. "Identify yourself and your unit," Jim called back, using military protocol to verify the person's identity. "Officer David Rodriguez, Lincoln PD. We're conducting room-by-room clearance. Open the door so we can verify that this area is secure." Jim recognized the appropriate police terminology and response protocols, but he remained cautious. "I need you to slide your badge under the door so I can verify your identity." There was a brief pause. Then a police badge appeared on the door. Jim examined it carefully, checking for signs of authenticity while maintaining his defensive position. The badge appeared legitimate, and the officer's responses suggested proper law enforcement training. After verifying the officer's identity through additional security questions, Jim began dismantling the barricade he had constructed. As he opened the door, Officer Rodriguez entered the classroom with his weapon drawn, immediately assessing the defensive positions and improvised weapons that Jim had created. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez muttered, looking around the transformed classroom. "Who set all this up?" "I did," Jim said simply. Rodriguez looked at Jim more closely, noting his calm demeanor and professional way he had arranged the defensive positions. "What's your background?" "Military," Jim replied without elaborating. The officer nodded, understanding immediately. "Well, whatever your training was, it probably saved these kids' lives. We found evidence that the shooters were planning to target second-floor classrooms after they finished with the main level." As police officers began evacuating students from the classroom, Tyler Harrison approached Jim with an expression of shame and gratitude. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm sorry about the way we treated you. We had no idea." "You couldn't have known," Jim said, placing a reassuring hand on the teenager's shoulder. "But I hope you've learned something important today about not judging people based on appearances." The evacuation proceeded smoothly, with Jim's students following police instructions with the discipline and focus he had taught them during their brief but intensive tactical training. As they moved through the hallway toward the emergency exits, several students thanked him for protecting them and expressed amazement at the transformation they had witnessed. The aftermath of the Lincoln High School shooting revealed the full extent of what Jim's intervention had prevented. The two shooters, both former students with grievances against the school, had planned to systematically target classrooms on the second floor after completing their assault on the main level. Room 237 had been specifically mentioned in their planning documents as a target location. Police investigators who examined Jim's defensive preparations were astounded by the sophistication and effectiveness of the measures he had implemented using only materials available in a typical classroom. Federal security experts who reviewed the incident concluded that Jim's military training had almost certainly prevented multiple casualties. The defensive positions and tactical procedures implemented in Room 237 represent the most effective civilian response to an active shooter situation that we've ever documented, reported FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who led the federal investigation. The substitute teacher's background and training turned what could have been a massacre into a successful defense operation. But Jim's impact on Lincoln High School extended far beyond his actions during the shooting itself. In the weeks following the incident, school administrators asked him to help develop new security protocols and emergency response procedures based on his military expertise and the lessons learned during the crisis. Working with law enforcement and federal security experts, Jim created comprehensive training programs that taught teachers and staff how to implement effective defensive measures during emergency situations. His protocols went far beyond the standard lockdown procedures that most schools relied on, incorporating tactical principles adapted for civilian educational environments. The training programs Jim developed became models for school security preparation throughout the region. His approach emphasized active defense measures, strategic positioning, and psychological preparation that could help civilians respond effectively to life-threatening situations without requiring extensive military training. Most importantly, Jim's work with students extended beyond emergency preparedness into broader life skills that built confidence, discipline, and resilience. The teenagers who had experienced his leadership during the crisis became advocates for respect, focus, and the importance of recognizing people's hidden qualities and capabilities. Tyler Harrison, who had been the primary disruptor in Jim's class, underwent a complete transformation following the incident. He became one of Jim's most dedicated students, eventually earning a scholarship to study criminal justice with the goal of becoming a law enforcement officer. "Mr. Mitchell showed me what real leadership looks like," Tyler said during his high school graduation speech. "He taught me that respect isn't something you give based on someone's job title or appearance, but something you give because you recognize their character and capabilities." Sarah Chun, who had been doing homework for other classes during Jim's math lessons, became fascinated by the tactical and strategic thinking she had witnessed during the crisis. She eventually pursued engineering studies with a focus on security systems and emergency preparedness technology. Marcus Williams, who had been playing games on his phone instead of paying attention to lessons, developed a deep appreciation for focus and discipline that helped him excel academically and eventually earn admission to a competitive university program. Jessica Rodriguez, who had been texting her boyfriend during class, became interested in emergency medical training and eventually became a paramedic, crediting Jim's calm leadership during the crisis as inspiration for her career choice. The transformation of these students represented more than individual success stories. It demonstrated how one person's hidden expertise and character could create lasting positive change in an entire community. Jim's influence extended through his students to their families, friends, and future careers, creating a ripple effect of improved leadership, discipline, and respect for others. Jim's formal teaching career began the following semester, when Lincoln High School offered him a permanent position teaching mathematics and serving as coordinator for the school's new emergency preparedness program. His classroom became known as one of the most disciplined and effective learning environments in the school, not because of strict rules or harsh discipline, but because students understood they were learning from someone whose expertise and character commanded genuine respect. The military precision and leadership skills that had made Jim an effective special operations soldier translated perfectly into educational environments once students understood the depth of his experience and capabilities. His classes became models for engaged learning, mutual respect, and the kind of focused attention that many teachers struggle to achieve with teenage students. But Jim's most significant contribution to education came through the comprehensive security and leadership training programs he developed for schools throughout the region. His methods were adopted by over 40 school districts, training thousands of teachers and staff members in effective emergency response procedures that went far beyond traditional lockdown protocols. The training programs emphasize the importance of active defense measures, strategic thinking, and psychological preparation that can help civilian educators respond effectively to crisis situations. Jim's approach recognized that teachers and school staff needed practical skills and confidence to protect students, not just passive procedures that left them vulnerable to determined attackers. Federal education and security agencies began incorporating Jim's methods into national guidelines for school emergency preparedness. His tactical principles, adapted for civilian environments, became standard components of teacher training programs in states across the country. The impact of Jim's work was measured not just in the schools that adopted his training programs, but in the broader cultural shift toward recognizing the importance of practical emergency preparedness and the value of military experience in civilian professions. His success demonstrated how veterans could transition their specialized skills into educational roles that benefited entire communities. 10 years after the Lincoln High School shooting, Jim's influence had expanded far beyond his original classroom. The students he had protected and taught during the crisis had graduated and begun careers in law enforcement, emergency services, education, and other fields where they carried forward the lessons they had learned about leadership, respect, and effective response to challenging situations. Tyler Harrison had become a police officer specializing in school security, implementing Jim's tactical principles in law enforcement training programs. Sarah Chun had developed innovative security technologies that were being used in schools nationwide. Marcus Williams had become a teacher himself, incorporating Jim's leadership methods into his own classroom management approach. The trace that Jim had left extended through these students and countless others who had learned from his example. His influence was visible in improved emergency preparedness programs, more effective educational leadership methods, and a generation of young people who understood the importance of recognizing and respecting the hidden capabilities of others. Lincoln High School's security protocols, based on Jim's tactical expertise, have been tested multiple times over the years and have consistently proven effective in protecting students and staff during various emergency situations. His training programs have prevented several potential tragedies and have become the gold standard for school emergency preparedness throughout the region. But perhaps Jim's most important legacy was a cultural change he had created within educational environments. Teachers and administrators who worked with his programs developed greater confidence in their ability to protect students and handle crisis situations. Students learned to respect educators as potential sources of protection and guidance rather than simply viewing them as authority figures to be challenged or ignored. The substitute teacher who had been mocked and disrespected by his students had transformed into one of the most influential educators in the region, not through traditional academic credentials or teaching methods, but through the demonstration of character, capability, and dedication to protecting others that defined his military service and civilian career. 20 years after transitioning from Navy SEAL to substitute teacher, Jim Mitchell had created educational and security innovations that continued to protect students throughout the country. His methods were taught in teacher training programs. His tactical principles were incorporated into federal security guidelines, and his leadership approach had influenced thousands of educators who carried his methods into their own classrooms and schools.